What if one of the most famous mysteries in modern history was never really a mystery to begin with? For decades, the Bermuda Triangle has been linked to vanished ships, missing aircraft, and stories that feel almost impossible to explain. But here's the problem. Most people know the legend. Almost no one knows what actually happened. And when you finally look at the facts, something unexpected happens. The mystery doesn't get deeper. It starts to fall apart. So the real question is, were we ever searching for the truth, or just believing the story we wanted to believe? The flight that never came back. One moment, everything is routine. 5 U.S. Navy planes are flying a familiar training route over the Atlantic. Clear skies, experienced pilots, nothing unusual. And then, something goes wrong. A voice comes through the radio, uncertain, not panicked, just confused. The lead pilot says his compass isn't working. He can't tell which direction is west. Think about that for a second. Over an open ocean, with no landmarks, no reference points, losing direction doesn't just mean getting lost. It means there's no clear way back. The pilots begin to circle, but instead of finding land, they drift further out. The ocean below doesn't look right anymore. The sky feels unfamiliar. It's as if something is off, but none of them can explain what. Fuel starts running low. The final transmissions aren't dramatic. No explosion, no clear emergency, just fragments of confusion, hesitation, and then silence. All 5 planes vanish. No wreckage, no confirmed debris, nothing. And then it gets worse. A rescue aircraft is sent to find them. That plane never returns either. 6 aircraft, 14 men, gone. This incident would later be known as the Flight 19 disappearance, and it's one of the biggest reasons the Bermuda Triangle became a global mystery. But here's what most people don't realize. The story you've heard about that day might not actually be true. A pattern? Or something else? At first, it feels like just one tragic accident. Strange, but still explainable. Something you could dismiss as coincidence. But then it doesn't stay alone. Years before Flight 19, a massive U.S. Navy cargo ship, the USS Cyclops AC-4, set out across the Atlantic with over 300 men on board, and it never arrived. No distress call, no warning, no storm report that clearly explained what happened, and most unsettling of all, no wreckage was ever found. Just silence. And that's where the shift begins. Because after this, more reports slowly start to surface across different years and different situations. Ships found drifting with no crew, aircraft losing contact mid-flight, pilots describing instruments behaving strangely just before disappearing from radar. On their own, each case sounds ordinary enough. Mechanical failure, human error, sudden weather changes, nothing impossible. But when you stop looking at them one by one and start hearing them together, something changes in how your mind processes it. It stops feeling like separate accidents and starts feeling like a pattern. And once that idea takes hold, it becomes difficult to ignore. Every new disappearance doesn't feel random anymore. It feels like confirmation that something is happening in the same region, under the same conditions, for reasons no one can fully explain. And that is how the idea of the Bermuda Triangle slowly takes shape. Not as a proven mystery, but as something far more powerful, a pattern people started to believe was real. And without anyone officially declaring it, a stretch of ocean stops being just geography and quietly becomes a place people begin to fear. But the real question is, were these events actually connected, or did we simply become too good at connecting them? When the story took over the truth, for a long time, these incidents were just scattered reports, unconnected, confusing, and buried deep in official records. But then something changed. The story didn't stay in investigation files anymore. It moved into books, newspapers, and later documentaries, and that's where everything quietly shifted around the Bermuda Triangle. Because the moment these events entered public storytelling, they stopped being treated as separate accidents and started being shaped into a single idea. Not because new evidence appeared, but because the old evidence was being told differently. Books began describing disappearances as impossible to explain. Headlines focused only on the most dramatic parts. Small uncertainties were removed, and gaps were filled with suggestion instead of fact. And without anyone formally deciding it, the same incidents slowly began to merge into something larger in the public mind. Not in reality, but in perception. Because repetition has a strange effect. It doesn't just spread information, it strengthens belief. Even when nothing new is happening, and in reality, nothing new was happening. No sudden increase in disappearances, no confirmed pattern emerging from data, just the same scattered cases being retold again and again, each time slightly more dramatic than before. But the human mind doesn't sit comfortably with uncertainty, so it does something automatic. It fills in the gaps. It connects what isn't clearly connected. It prefers a complete story over an incomplete truth, even if that story is wrong. And slowly, something subtle happens. Uncertainty turns into pattern. Pattern turns into belief. And belief starts to feel like fact. The Bermuda Triangle stops being a list of unrelated incidents and becomes something else entirely. A place with a reputation. A place where normal explanations begin to feel insufficient. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The ocean didn't change. The physics didn't change. The data didn't suddenly become more mysterious. Only the story did. And once a story becomes strong enough, it no longer survives because it's proven every time. It survives because it's repeated often enough to feel true, which leaves one final question hanging. Were we actually uncovering a hidden mystery? Or slowly watching a story turn into something we eventually started to believe as fact? The reality behind the reputation. By the time the legend fully formed, the Bermuda Triangle was already seen as something unusual, almost unnatural. But when researchers went back and actually reviewed the records, something surprising appeared. The mystery wasn't as clean or as consistent as the story suggested. Because this isn't a remote or unexplored region, it's one of the most heavily traveled ocean corridors in the world. Thousands of ships and flights pass through it every year. And in that context, incidents, however tragic, aren't statistically strange on their own. When you look closely at older cases, another layer appears. Sudden Atlantic storms capable of overwhelming even large ships. Navigation systems that were far less accurate in earlier decades. Communication tools that often failed before distress signals could be properly sent. In many cases, the mystery doesn't begin with confirmed disappearance. It begins with incomplete information. Missing logs, delayed reports, accounts that were written long after the events happened. And over time, those gaps were filled, not with data, but with interpretation. But here's where things become more complicated. Because not everything fits neatly into explanation. Some cases still leave unanswered details. Some reports don't fully align. And even among researchers, there isn't complete agreement on every incident. And that's important. Because once a place gains a reputation, something subtle happens. The mind stops evaluating each case independently. A normal storm starts to feel unusual. A missing record feels unexplained. Separate events begin to feel connected. Not because they are, but because they are being viewed through the same lens. And that lens becomes powerful. But here's the real tension. If many of these incidents can be explained individually, and yet the feeling of a pattern still remains. What exactly are we reacting to? The events themselves, or the meaning we've attached to them? And that question leads somewhere even deeper. Because now we have to ask, if the facts are mostly explainable, why does the mystery still refuse to disappear? The psychology behind why mysteries never die. Even after every explanation, every report, and every correction, the story of the Bermuda Triangle still doesn't fully disappear. Not because it remains unsolved, but because the human mind was never designed to sit comfortably with uncertainty. Uncertainty doesn't feel like nothing. It feels like something unfinished. And when something feels unfinished, the brain doesn't stop. It tries to complete it. A missing ship becomes a mystery. A delayed report becomes suspicion. A coincidence becomes a connection. Not because the facts change, but because the mind refuses to leave gaps in meaning empty. And even when explanations exist, storms, navigation errors, communication failures, they don't always replace the feeling that something is still unresolved. Because people don't remember information the way they remember emotion. And mystery is not just information, it is emotion. That's why stories like this don't survive in records. They survive in memory. Not because they are proven, but because they are felt. And slowly, the mind begins to prefer something incomplete, but meaningful over something complete, but ordinary. So the Bermuda Triangle doesn't stay alive because it is truly unexplained. It stays alive because the mind keeps returning to what was never fully closed. And that creates a quiet contradiction. Because now we understand how these mysteries are formed, how they spread, how they survive without new evidence. But understanding something doesn't always end it. Sometimes it makes it stronger. And that leaves one final uncomfortable thought. If we now see how easily the mind builds mystery from gaps, does that make the mystery disappear? Or does it simply reveal that we still prefer a story that feels unfinished over a reality that feels too simple to believe? Why the mystery never really ends. By the time all the explanations are laid out, the Bermuda Triangle stops looking like a place hiding something unknown and starts looking like something far more familiar, a story shaped over time by perception, repetition, and belief. Because when you step back, the events that built the legend don't point toward anything extraordinary. They point toward storms, navigation limits of earlier decades, communication gaps, and the natural risks of one of the busiest ocean routes in the world. On their own, these are ordinary explanations. But over time, they stopped being seen as separate incidents and became something else in memory. Not because the facts changed, but because the interpretation did. And even when everything is understood logically, something still doesn't fully disappear. Because the mind can accept explanation, but it doesn't erase feeling. And that's where the real divide exists, between what we know and what we experience. Because human thinking is not built only on logic. It runs on patterns, emotion, and meaning. And once a story becomes emotionally familiar, it stops behaving like information and starts behaving like memory. That's why the Bermuda Triangle doesn't truly disappear from public imagination. Not because it remains unsolved, but because it became a mental shortcut for uncertainty itself. A way for the mind to label the unknown. A place it can point to when things don't immediately make sense. But maybe the most important truth was never about the ocean at all. It was about the way we process it, the way we turn randomness into meaning, and events into stories. Because in the end, the Bermuda Triangle was never just a place on the map. It was a reflection of something far more consistent. The human need to find meaning, even when there may be none. And that's why the mystery never really ends. It simply changes form inside the mind that refuses to stop interpreting the unknown. The story of the Bermuda Triangle is not built from a single mystery, but from many separate events that were slowly linked together over time. What were once isolated incidents, shaped by weather, navigation limits of earlier decades, and communication failures, were gradually grouped into one idea through repetition in media, books, and public retelling. And as that repetition grew, something subtle changed. The focus moved away from what actually happened in each case, and shifted toward the feeling those stories created. Because the human mind doesn't just store events, it connects uncertainty into patterns, fills missing gaps with meaning, and turns repetition into something that feels like evidence. Over time, perception begins to operate independently from fact, turning ordinary risks of a heavily traveled ocean region into a story of unexplained disappearances. But what this really reveals is not something about the ocean, it's something about us. how easily separate events can become a single story, how repetition can start to feel like truth, and how the unknown is often shaped more by interpretation than by evidence. Because in the end, the mystery was never only in the sea. The story of the Bermuda Triangle is less about something unknown in the ocean and more about how the human mind turns uncertainty into meaning, because once a story becomes powerful enough, it doesn't survive because it's proven, it survives because it's believed. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe to Brainy Bites, and turn on notifications for more deep dive stories like this.